Welcome to episode 99 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode in the show notes, which is www.7, so the word all spelled out, SEVEN health.com/99.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everybody, and thanks for joining me for another installment of Real Health Radio. So on this week's show, it's another one of my solo episodes, and actually what I'm going to be doing is talking about an app that I've been working on for the last couple of years. So the app is called Tummy, and it allows health professionals like me to enable my clients to log their food intake, their symptoms, their body measurements, daily activities, and a lot more. So as part of the show, I'm going to talk a little about how the app came to be and why it's different from what else is out there. I'm going to talk about where I'd like and we'd like to be taking Tummy, because it's not just me that works on it, and what the vision is with it. And I'm going to give you a chance for a limited time to try it out for free. And I did recently do a webinar all about Tummy, and given that it was a webinar, I was able to demonstrate how to use it and what you can do. So something I obviously can't do on a podcast. So I will be linking to the webinar replay in the show notes for people to check out. And if you wanted to just jump to the part where I demonstrate Tummy, that starts at around 32 minutes, 30 seconds. So a lot of the information I cover in the show will be stuff that I covered in the webinar. There will be extra stuff, particularly towards the end, with me speculating about where we'd like to take Tummy, something that I didn't go into so much with the webinar, but there will be a lot of overlap. And the reason I'm doing a podcast on Tummy is because of the reach that I get with it. I get way more downloads and way more listens on this show than any article that I write or any webinar that I do. And because of the nature of podcasts and searching for podcast episodes, it's much easier and it's more likely that someone will be listening to this in 1 month's time or 2 months' time or 6 months' time. Then they will be likely to be reading a blog post from that time ago, or a Facebook post from that time ago, or finding the webinar replay from that time. And most people just aren't going to spend 60 minutes or 70 minutes watching a webinar. Like, that feels like a big commitment. And that is what is so great about podcasting. There is no other format that I can think of where people will spend as much time consuming my content as with podcasting. Like, very few people are going to read an hour or 90 minutes of my material every week. Very few people are going to watch a 70 or an 80-minute video of mine each week. But lots of people will listen to my podcast of that length every single week. And it's because you can be doing other things at the same time. It doesn't take your undivided attention. You can be cooking or commuting or working out at the gym and still be listening. So that's why I wanted to do a podcast on this, because way more people are going to be exposed to it than any other format that I can think of. And ultimately, what I'm wanting is more and more people to hear about and start using Tummy. And that's why I wanted to do this show on it, especially considering the amount of time and energy I put into its development. So that's what the show's going to be about. So let me start with how Tummy came to be and how I met Ryan Snyder, who is the founder of Tummy. So in my early days of practice, I probably had a pretty narrow view of what I thought I would be doing with clients. I thought people would be coming to me with some list of symptoms. I'd look at what they are eating and simply tell them to eat more of this food or that food and to take these supplements and things would get better. Like, I was the expert and I was the one with all the suggestions and the information, and that was why they were coming to me. And I kind of imagined that I'd probably discover that there'd be this one perfect diet and I'd just be getting people to transition into that way of eating and everything would be getting better, and that if people were coming to me and then I gave them clear advice, they'd go off and they'd do it. But in a fairly short amount of time, I realized that this wasn't the case and it just wasn't so straightforward. I could have one person eating in one way and it was working amazingly well for them, but then there was someone else someone who actually seemed rather similar, but who wasn't doing so well when they ate those same foods. And I realized that it wasn't always about the food per se, but other factors connected to food. So things like meal timings and how long people were going between meals, or at what times of the day they should be having more of their food coming in. I noticed that the state that someone was in when they were eating mattered hugely. So whether they were in a rush and were eating their meals while doing emails versus, say, sitting quietly at a table or eating their meal outside. I also realized that many non-food factors are important. So there's the more obvious stuff that most people would think of, so sleep or exercise. But things like light exposure and work and life stress and body image and self-esteem and things that I don't see enough nutritionists really working on, but it was coming up more and more in my practice and seeing how crucial this stuff was. And finally, I guess just the realization that people's lives are messy. Me just telling someone a bunch of information didn't automatically translate into them changing their behaviors. I really learned that being a success as a practitioner was more about compassion and meeting people where they're at and understanding psychology and those type of things, more than just knowing more and more nutritional knowledge. So in those early stages and over time, how I practice changed. So increasing awareness and getting clients to pay attention to different factors in their life really became the core of what I do. And one of the things that was then the centerpiece of this was a food log. And when you hear the word food log, maybe it conjures up some thoughts or some associations. So it might be you think of MyFitnessPal, where you're putting in your food to make sure you're not going over some calorie amount. Or maybe you think of it as something to keep you on track so that you're only eating good foods and not bad foods, or just something you connect with attempts to lose weight, which is incredibly common, is most of the time why people have been using food logs. But for me, this isn't what a food log is about. And really, the log isn't just about food. It's much broader than that. So I started using an Excel spreadsheet that clients could fill in. And it was actually something that I created myself based on a template I got from another training program I completed. And with it, you could mark down the food you're eating, and it would then calculate the calories and the macros for you. But the bigger part for me was getting people to include symptoms and other lifestyle factors. So lifestyle factors could be things like what time they were going to bed, what time they were waking up, if they'd done exercise that day. The symptom side of things, it was looking at physical symptoms, mental symptoms, emotional symptoms. So physically, like headaches or digestive upset, mental symptoms like trouble concentrating or foggy headedness, and then emotional symptoms. So were people having moments of feeling down or low or angry or teary, or were they having positive emotions as well, like joy or feeling at ease or whatever it may be? And they could then mark this down. And it allowed people to then mark down these different indicators so that there would be a record of it. And they could also mark down other like body measurements as well. So if someone was tracking their temperature or their pulse or their blood glucose or their stools or whatever, they could then include this as well. So it was really comprehensive and allowed me to practice in a way that I really discovered worked best, which was helping people to see patterns in what they were doing and the symptoms they were getting, and making the connection between, say, diet and lifestyle factors and how these things correlated. It wasn't just me telling people the same diet or the same list of good and bad foods, but getting people to figure this stuff out for themselves and creating a sense of autonomy and helping people to discover that they could do this stuff for the rest of their life. It wasn't just me getting them to follow some diet that they then be sick of in a matter of months. And I didn't want to like become some guru or some authoritarian figure that was just telling people what they should be doing. And the more I could involve clients in the decision making and look at habit formation and how the environment affects habits and behaviors, etc., and have the client recognize this stuff too, like the better. And I will say that this is still a work in progress for me. I'm constantly trying to be a better coach or a better practitioner and be moving from telling people what to do and having it be a really joint process. And I would say, thankfully, every 6 months, every year, when I look back on what I'm doing now and where I was before, I'm continuing to see improvements. But just making these changes really did help. And by going in this way and in this fashion and this style, I saw people getting better and better results. The problem was, and there was just one big snag, and that was that the Excel spreadsheet wasn't great. It was pretty clunky. So for an individual, it would take a long time for them to fill in. And this was especially true if people were going down the calories route and were having to look up certain foods that it wouldn't be populating for them. It was really easy to delete some of the formulas working in the background on the Excel. So it would then start to mess up the calculations and it wouldn't be giving the right information. And really, as technology changed and people were spending more and more time on their phone, the Excel document just didn't work so well. And for me as a practitioner as well, it was really cumbersome. There was so much manual work that I had to do. And this was especially the case if I wanted to, say, compare certain symptoms or markers now versus what was happening 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago. And just going back through all this stuff took a long time and it was a lot of manual work. So I was in a situation where what I was doing felt like a much better option than any of the alternatives. And I tried out different things, but I also knew that it could be a lot better. And so I was talking to one of my clients about this stuff and, lamenting how much I would like it to be easier for them and for me. And she worked in IT, and this was why I brought it up. And she said that she had a colleague who might be able to help me out. And that was how I was introduced to Ryan. So Ryan Snyder is the guy who has built Tummy from nothing. I worked on it with him as part of this, but if it's anyone's baby, Tummy is Ryan's baby. So it was back in about the April of 2015 when we first met in person after kind of emailing for a little while. And in very English fashion, we went to the pub, we had some pints of Guinness as a way of introduction. And I chatted about how I worked with clients and the shortfalls I saw in other apps that were on the market, which is something I'll go through. But I also explained to him what I was doing currently and how helpful it was, but just some of the shortfalls I felt with it. And Ryan told me about his backstory in terms of design and app development. And he was working on an idea for an app that would be helpful to solve his own GI issues that he'd been dealing with, say, a couple of years, but he just hadn't been able to solve them. So Ryan decided to sign up with me as a client, and that way I could then help him with his digestive issues, and then he could use the first-hand experience of working with me to help him then create the app. And this was how Tummy was then born. So Ryan worked with me and he saw the things that I was getting him to do and to focus on, and he created a way to make this much easier for both of us. And so while we were working together, Ryan commenced building Tummy, and then since we finished up together and he stopped being my client, pretty much once a month or so, we jump on Skype together, we would chat about Tummy for an hour or more, and we'd brainstorm ways to make it better, and then Ryan would go away and he would make this stuff reality. And while it was just me giving input to start with, it's now been much more broadened out, and we've been getting feedback from many clients and many practitioners. And for the last 18 months, since about January of 2016, I've been road testing Tummy myself and with clients and continuing to improve things up until the point that we're at now. And so Ryan, with the help of a small development team, has built Tummy from the ground up, and he continues to improve on this. And then a lot of these improvements are based on the suggestions of myself and other practitioners and clients. So you may be then thinking, like, why did we bother going to all this trouble? There is tons of food apps on the market. Why couldn't we just use one of those instead? So while I think there are a lot of food log apps on the market and there's a lot of interest in this space, none of them were doing what I wanted them to be able to do. they were often limited to just doing one thing, or they were focusing way too heavily on one area, an area that often wasn't important. So for example, the majority of food blog apps really, from my perspective, myopically focus on calories and weight loss. And it's like this is the only reason you'd ever want to pay attention to what you're eating. And this is something I did go through in a bit of detail in the webinar, using MyFitnessPal as an example. And when you sign up, it asks you how much you weigh, how much do you want to lose, how quickly do you want to lose this weight, and then it tells you how many calories you should be eating. But the recommendations that it spits out are very questionable. And when I gave it my correct details, so I put in my correct weight, I put in my activity levels, and I suggested that I wanted to lose weight, which I don't, but I just wanted to do it as part of the example. It told me that I should be eating 1,200 calories a day. Now, this is an insanely low amount of food. And to put things in perspective, the recommended calorie intake for a 3-year-old is between 1,000 and 1,400 calories. In the famous Minnesota starvation experiment, which if you haven't heard of before, I did a whole podcast episode on it before, which you can find. It's www.7-health.com/42. And as part of that experiment, and this was called a semi-starvation experiment, they were feeding the men around 1,600 calories a day. So for me to be told 1,200 calories a day should be my goals is a little worrying. And I've had clients in the past who've come to me saying they were trying to follow an 800 calorie a day diet because that was what MyFitnessPal told them to eat to hit their weight loss goals. And I do want to just say, it's not just MyFitnessPal that does this. This is how many of the food logging apps on the market work. And in my line of work and with so many of the clients I'm working with, they do have real issues around food and with seeing calories and macros and these kind of figures every time they log in. And if the log is telling them they should be eating 1,600 calories a day, despite them actually knowing they need to be eating more and wanting to be eating more, every day they are eating more and it's then flashing up telling them that they're eating too much, it becomes overwhelming. And so I can tell them to ignore this or just don't worry about it, but it's not so easily. And this can be hugely triggering for people. And whether or not someone has issues around food, calories and macro figures can get in the way of them paying attention to things like hunger and fullness, or looking at how they can be more consistent with their eating, or a whole load of other things. It becomes a distraction. So I wanted some way of being able to have people to log their food, but not have calories and macros interfere with this. And there wasn't anything on the market, or wasn't much on the market offering this. Then there's the fact that I wanted clients to be able to pay attention and to record other factors apart from just what they ate and how many calories was in it and the stuff they talked about before. Because let's just say a client is only marking down the food that they eat, and over the space of 3 days, they eat the exact same meals. So they have the same breakfast, they have the same mid-morning snack, they have the same lunch, the same dinner. On the surface, maybe you'd expect them to feel similar on each of their days. But there could be a multitude of factors why this may be different. So say on one night they go to bed at 10 p.m. and have a good night's sleep. On another night they are getting to bed at midnight and they have a restless night's sleep. This difference in sleep pattern is going to have a dramatic impact on how they feel. And if someone is regularly going to bed at 10 p.m. versus regularly going to bed at 1 a.m., we'll see a real difference in the outcome with their health. There could be the same difference with meal timings. So on one day, they wake at 7 a.m., they then have their breakfast at 8 a.m., they have their lunch at 1:30 p.m., they have their dinner at 7 p.m. On another day, they also get up at 7 a.m., but instead they now have breakfast at 10 a.m., so a much bigger gap. They have their lunch at the same time at 1:30 p.m., but their dinner now isn't till 9 p.m., so again, a much bigger gap. So despite eating the exact same food, these changes in meal timings could have a huge impact on how they experience the day. And how they experience the day was something I wanted them to be able to pay attention to and keep a record of. So on one day, they may feel calm and things are going well. On the next day, it could be overwhelmed and feeling anxious, and they have an upset stomach in the afternoon or a piercing headache at 5 p.m. And all of these differences could be happening, despite the fact that they had identical food logs across 3 days. And what someone is eating and whether this is going to be helpful or harmful is context specific. Like, while we can make assumptions looking at the food and the calories on its own, without other information, it's nearly impossible to have a real rich understanding of what's going on and what's working and what's not. And this kind of brings up the next important point, which works on the back of all this extra information, which is self-awareness. Like, in my mind, self-awareness is the key to health and is why I want someone to keep a food log. Like, with my clients, I'm constantly getting them to pay attention to their different symptoms and their eating habits and seeing if there's a connection between the two. And if someone is feeling bloated in the afternoon, let's look at what they ate earlier in that day, or let's look at where they are in their cycle to see if that could be the reason. If someone's feeling tired, let's look at their sleep from last night or the last couple of nights. Or let's look at how much food they've been eating or how long they're going between meals. And it's almost impossible to do this kind of stuff if there's not a record of these things. Like, if I was to ask you what time you went to bed last Tuesday, chances are you wouldn't be able to answer. And this becomes even more true the further and further back we go. But if there is a record of this stuff, it's easy to answer that question. It's easy to look into that to find those kind of patterns. And this then connects into another area that has become a big part of what I focus on with clients, which is habit formation. It's something that I briefly talked about in last week's podcast when I looked at food prep and snack suggestions. And it was something I went into a lot of detail earlier in the year in a podcast that I dedicated to goals and goal setting and achieving goals and how habit formation is a big part of this. So I will put links to both of those in the show notes. Because it's one thing to look at where someone is now and where they want to be, but it's another to then make that a reality. Like, just knowing what you want to change isn't enough, and it's not going to necessarily make it happen. And again, if someone is only recording what and how much they're eating, this doesn't paint much of a picture. But if there's more information about sleep times and meal times and when certain symptoms are occurring, there's a lot more to work with. So, for example, I could look at what someone is doing with their eating and realize that there are many suggestions I'd love to make. I could maybe get the impression that their eating and their food stuff at this stage isn't a priority, or they're being rather reactive as part of their eating. But there's much more to it than just the food. Like, if they're recording all this other information, I may be able to see certain reasons why this could possibly be the case. So, for example, the individual is always going to bed around midnight or 1 a.m. I could see that they wait many hours before waking in the morning and then having their breakfast. I could see that they're having regular bouts of loose stools, or they get headaches most afternoons. And habits are about breaking things down into little pieces. So rather than just selling the person that they need to eat better or to follow this template, we look at, okay, what are the separate pieces as part of this and how can we make this change? And typically you want to be focusing on one or maybe two things at a time. So over time with this person, we would work on the sleep habits and we'd get them to start going to bed earlier. And as part of this, it could be getting them to turn off screens earlier and other things that help them to fall asleep quicker. We'd get them to start having maybe an earlier breakfast and paying attention to, does this help in terms of their energy? And maybe it does, and it means they're more consistent with the eating of other meals. And they notice that when they're doing this, the headaches that were in the afternoon start to go away. We can look at the digestive issues. So we look at, is there any foods that could be possibly causing this? Or maybe it's how they're eating. So they're eating in a rush. Or maybe it's just stress levels in general. And if we get them going for a walk after a meal or before a meal, or doing some meditation, that this starts to help. And this is what improving someone's health through food and lifestyle really looks like. It's changing habits while paying attention to the results. And it's how I want to practice, and it's how I am practicing, and it's how people get the best results and also keep up the changes long term. But this kind of thing, it really only works if someone has a way of recording this information and paying attention to it. And what was on the market, this just wasn't an option. And so this is why we created Tummy, because none of the other online options allowed us to do this. They just didn't cover what we thought was important. So I want to talk a little about what Tummy is, how it works, what you can do with it. And as I said earlier, as part of the webinar that I did on this, I walk you through this process and you can see it in real time. So you can check out that replay in the show notes, but I'm going to just talk you through some of it without having the visuals. So Tummy works on phones, it works on tablets, it works on computers. If I'm using it and I'm entering it for my own personal stuff, my own personal records, I will use my phone or I'll use my laptop. But when I'm analyzing clients' logs, so from a practitioner standpoint, I'll always use my laptop. And this is just due to having added screen space and being able to have multiple tabs open and reports open. It just makes it way easier than if I tried to do it on my phone. So as a practitioner, I have an account with Tummy. And when someone then signs up with me and becomes my client, I then register them on Tummy and they are then sent an invite. And when I'm sending this invite, I get to set what the client sees. So remember earlier I mentioned that lots of clients have issues with seeing calories or with seeing macros or with seeing other targets. Well, as a practitioner, I can choose to turn this stuff on or off. And in reality, I turn this stuff off for all my clients to start with. It's not where I want to start with them because there's so many other changes and improvements that someone can be making without having to look at the calories. And then later on, if we decide that, okay, this is now relevant, we can turn it on and we can go through it. But for a lot of my clients, we actually never go through this stuff. It just isn't that relevant. And it means that then Tummy is still really easy for them to use. And I'm not having to tell them to just ignore this info because it's simply not displayed to them. So let me just go through then what it's like to use Tummy as a client or as a user, and then I can look at from the practitioner perspective. And look, some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about from a user perspective is also going to be very relevant for the practitioner perspective. So as a user, you can log all your meals on Tummy, which is pretty common with a food log app, but it also lets you to put what time you had that meal, which isn't so common, and it also allows you to add a comment with each of your meals. So often I will use a hunger and fullness chart when I'm working with clients. So I can get them to add this in the comments. So something like I was a 3 when I started eating and then I was a 6 when I finished up. Or someone could put a comment that they were eating in a rush or that it was a nice relaxed meal or whatever they feel is relevant. And just adding in these comments, it makes people more aware and it helps clients to then stop and think about this stuff. And it's then also useful for us to then come back and have a look at these comments and have a look at how often certain things are occurring. Tummy, as part of entering in food, it learns things that you commonly eat. So when you enter in your breakfast or your lunch or your snack, it lets you add in frequent items. The other helpful thing is that you just type in each item and then hit save and then it's done. So for many of the food logging apps, you have to search for each item first. So say you want to enter in a potato, it then lists like 50 or 100 different types of potatoes or potato-based food items. And then you have to choose one and you don't know which one to pick. Is it this kind of potato? Is it that kind of potato? And it can be quite overwhelming. So with Tummy, you just type it in and Tummy will match it up based on its food database. And this is something that we are continuing to work on, especially with creating better matches for British foods and British brands. But you also then have the ability to change the information for each of the items. So say, for example, you are focusing on calories and you're focusing on macros. And so when you enter 100 grams of yogurt, what Tummy automatically enters and matches up for you is different than when you look at your type of yogurt. You can then just go in and manually change the figures so that they're now correct. So the food side of things is much easier to enter, and it is definitely something we're constantly improving on. You have the ability to enter in your sleep. So you can mark down what time you went to bed, what time you wake up, and again, you can mark down a comment attached to this. So you can mark down if you had a nightmare, if you had trouble getting to sleep, or if you woke in the night to use the bathroom. All of these can be included in the comments, and I may often get clients to give their sleep, say a mark out of 10, and this just gets added in. And this is helpful because it then appears in the timeline. So when I'm looking at a particular day, I can not only see how much sleep someone's had and what time they've gone to bed and what time they've woken up, I can also see their comments about the sleep. So right from the start, I can see, okay, how things are going to be starting for that day. But better than just that, everything that someone marks down then links into different reports. So I can then open up a report on a client's sleep, and it will show me every single day what time they're going to bed, what time they're waking up, how many hours sleep they're getting, and then comments with each of these days. And if it's a female client, it even includes what day of their cycle they're in for each of these days. So we can look at how that affects sleep. And you can change the date range on this report to whatever you want. So you can look at it for just the recent records. You can go the whole time that you've been working with someone or the whole time that someone's been using Tummy and everything in between. In terms of entering information, as I mentioned, you can mark down your cycle as a female. So every time you get a period, you enter this as day 1, and then Tummy just keeps ticking over the days until you mark again that it's the start of your cycle. And so then when looking at Tummy in the daily timeline, at the top, it shows the cycle day that the client is on. And you can then click on this information and it brings up their whole cycle history. So all of their previous cycles, how many days they were, what days they started on, etc. You also then have the ability to enter in different symptoms. And this could be symptoms relating to the cycle, but it could be relating to anything. So symptoms are broken down by body parts, and again, you get to choose what time that's occurring, and you can add in comments. So if you had a headache, you would select head, you would then select the time, and then add in any note that you had about it. So maybe you say it was a migraine, or you took some painkillers, or it was at the front of the head. Any information that you think is relevant can then be added in. And as part of the symptoms section, you can then add in mood as a symptom. So you select mood and then you put in the notes that you were feeling low or you were feeling happy or whatever it may be. You also have the ability to add in different measurements. So at this stage, the different options are body temperature, blood glucose, bowel movements, pulse, sleep, urination, and weight. And with weight, this is another thing that the practitioner can turn off. So if I don't want a client to be tempted to weigh themselves or to be keeping track of their weight, I can then turn this off when I'm sending out the invite, and then this doesn't come up as an option when they're using Tummy. With things like temperature and blood glucose, both of these will be in different units depending on if someone is in the US system or using the metric system. So for temperature, it would be either Fahrenheit or Celsius. And with blood glucose, it would be millimole per liter or milligram per deciliter. And as the user, you then get to choose what units you want this to be in. But the great thing is, as the practitioner, it then is automatically changed over to the units that I want to see it in. So for example, if I'm living in the UK or in Australia and I think in Celsius, I could be working with a client who is in US, and when they're marking things down, they mark it down in Fahrenheit. But when they enter the stuff in Fahrenheit, when I then look at their logs and look at their information, it then displays it to me in Celsius. And this is really helpful because I don't think in Fahrenheit, and it just makes it much easier for me to do it that way. On the stool front, we use the Bristol stool chart, And if people are unfamiliar with this, we link to the page that then talks about what this is. So people can then enter in that they had a 4 or a 5 or whatever the corresponding number is. And with each of these measurements, just like everything else in tummy, you can mark down the time. You can also add in a comment. And again, all of these things can then be viewed as a report. And these reports aren't just something that the practitioner sees, but the individual can see. So you can look at what your bowel movements have been like for the last month, or you can compare your blood sugar over the last 6 weeks, and you can see if there's patterns there or if it's improving. And you can do all this really easily. It's a couple of clicks. It's very, very straightforward. And then the final thing you can keep track of is exercise. And it's not just exercise, it's activities. So it could be running, it could be basketball, it could be lifting weights, those kind of exercise habits. But it's also things like massage or meditation or gardening. So again, you mark down the activity that you did, the time, how long you did it for, and any comments that you want to make. And with this, tummy also syncs up with Jawbone and with Fitbit, which for those who aren't aware of these things are wearable fitness trackers. So you can then sync these up with tummy, and then it can automatically pull the information from this stuff. So it can pull the workout information, or it can pull your steps, or it can pull your sleep, etc. And this is something we are wanting to do with other apps too, and it's being worked on at the moment. So with an iPhone or with an iWatch, it automatically saves your steps in the health app, and we want to be able to pull that information in. Or for example, there's really fantastic apps for women for tracking their cycle. And we're working on it so that this information can also be automatically pulled into tummy, and you're not having to record things separately in 2 different places. So that's it on the recording front and what you can keep a record of. The final thing I want to mention is, as an individual user, is you then have the ability through tummy to message your practitioner. So if I'm working with a client and I then set them up with tummy and their tummy account, they have the ability to message me through tummy instead of sending me an email. And this is something that is still at this stage pretty basic. It's in its infancy, but it's something we're continuing to work on. And long term, the plan is that we can attach documents, so someone can send me, say, their blood test through tummy, or when I'm sending out my initial forms, that these can go out through tummy. And it'll be a while before this is a reality, but this is where we would like to take it. So that's the client or the individual user side of things. Let me now just speak about the practitioner side of things. And a lot of the benefits are stuff I've already touched on. And as I mentioned earlier, as a practitioner, you are inviting the client to use tummy and setting what they can and can't see, which you can then change and amend at any point. So you come in, you have access to all of your clients, and you can instantly pull up the accounts and the information that they've been entering in. You can see their daily timeline for everything that client is eating and doing and marking down, and you can go back through all of the different days. You can access all of the different reports based on the information that I talked about with all of the different markers, etc. So for me, I see clients every 2 weeks. So I can then, before I see them, I come in and I see what's happened over those last 2 weeks since we chatted. I can pull up the reports on their sleep or their bowel movements or their body temperature, and all this. If it's a female, it marks down again or links in with their cycle. So I can look at morning body temperature readings and the different days that they're on in their cycle and get a sense if they ovulated or not, depending on what I'm seeing with their temperature. Or I could check to see if they're getting loose stools around their period like they did last cycle, if they're still having sleep issues around ovulation like it's been going on for the last year or whatever it may be. So huge amounts of information that is really easy to access, that if I was trying to do this stuff manually, it would basically be impossible. There is an area called targets that I can then set as the practitioner. And this is something that doesn't have to be used to start with. And it's not really relevant to start with, I would say, for most people. But if as a practitioner, I want to give someone a calorie figure to aim for, then I can set this up in targets. And then each day in their timeline, it shows what the target is. And if someone is below that or above it, you can set macro ratios as a target. So if I want a client to be, say, having 60% carbs and 20% protein and 20% fat, I can then set this up. And then the timeline, it displays what the aim is and where someone is with those aims each day. You can then set up goals or targets for things like fruit intake, vegetable intake, alcohol, caffeine, sugar. And for all of these, it sets default targets, and these are based on the USDA, the NHS, the World Health Organization, and other appropriate organizations. But these are just default targets, and they can be changed. So you can make them higher, you can make them lower, based on what is appropriate for the client. And with all this stuff, it then also links into reports. So if you want to see what someone's protein intake has been like for the last month, I can see a report on that with daily totals in terms of grams and percentages of calories. If I want to see someone's alcohol consumption, I can open a report and it tells me for whatever period I want to look at. And as I said, this section, it doesn't have to be used. It can be turned off so that the client doesn't see any of this information and you don't even bother going through it with them. Or you can just set the calorie goals and forget everything else. Or you can add in these different things. So before I have a consult with someone, I come in, I go into Tummy, I go through all of this first. So I'll go through their food logs for each day. I can check their different reports for specific markers or symptoms. I can then look at my previous notes. I can look at the client's original forms, other tests that they've sent in, and I can then use all this to see, okay, how are things progressing? And I can then start to work out, okay, what might be helpful for us to focus on in this next consult, in the next couple of weeks, and then go from there. And I'm now at the point where I've just finishing up using Tummy with my third group of clients. So I take on clients at the start of the year, I then take them on at the midpoint of the year. And at this stage, I'm at my third group who is using this. And I now wonder if I didn't have Tummy, how I would be able to function. Because it really has become so integral to what I do, and it provides me with such a wealth of information that I would be at a genuine disadvantage if I wasn't using it. And I'd say the same thing for my clients. It's really easy for them to enter information. It's also easy for them to look through it themselves so they can start to notice patterns. They can start to increase their awareness. It's not just me pointing stuff out. And because as the practitioner, I have control over what they see, this makes a huge difference to who can use Tummy. Because, as I said, so many clients that I've worked with and continue to work with have real dieting scars. Like trying to tell them just to ignore the calories or ignore the macro figures, it's really difficult when it's staring them in the face every time. But because I have the ability to turn this stuff off, it makes things much easier. And if I want to, I can even turn off the function on Tummy for them to be able to enter food altogether. So in this instance, I could just be getting them to use Tummy so that they can keep a record for how much sleep they're getting or how often they're getting certain symptoms or for keeping a track of their cycle or whatever it may be. And then they can use this to analyze it over the longer term and to pay attention. So that is Tummy. And hopefully by me explaining all this, you can see why we built it and why it can be so useful for practitioners and for individuals. And look, the original intended audience for Tummy was practitioners. We wanted a tool that practitioners could add their clients or patients to and have them record all this kind of information and have access to it. But as we've discovered through this process, we'd actually love to then be able to have individuals be able to use it on their own. So they don't have to be under the guidance of a practitioner. They can then just sign up and use it on their own. And so this is something that we're working on at the moment. So how to separate this out for individual users. And then if someone is an individual user and they do then start working with a practitioner, how they can then link it up with that practitioner so they have access to that user account just like they do now. So I want to talk just briefly before I wrap this up of where we want to be taking tummy and some of the things we want to be adding in. But I do want to just add a couple of caveats, which is not all of this stuff is going to come to fruition. Like, we may get certain feedback and decide that we want to leave something out and instead go in a different direction. And B, even if we do go ahead with some of this stuff, I don't know exactly when it's going to be ready. So I just want to be cautious here to say that I'm not making any promises with this stuff. These are kind of the hopes and dreams at this stage. But with something like this, there's always going to be a good chance that things could change. So we'd like the ability to be adding in forms and adding in handouts, and this could be for practitioners to be then sending their clients, or it could be for individual users that can then download it. So if someone wants to follow a low FODMAP protocol, they'd be able to have this. If someone was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, there could be a handout or information on this. And this would also be part of a wider goal of making Tummy a training or an educational platform. So again, this would be training for practitioners on, say, the nutritional side, or working with disordered eating, or the psychology of being a better coach or a better practitioner, as well as training for individuals. So to better understand the nutrition or health or individual aspects of those things. So kind of like what I do with the podcast, but where it's not just the podcast, where there's audio content, video content, ebooks, that kind of thing. We want to expand on the target side of things so that people can then be inputting their own goals. So rather than it just be about calories or vegetable intake, someone could set up a daily or a weekly goal that then prompts them and reminds them to then mark off whether it's happening or not. We'd love to include recipe ideas and meal suggestions so that that's part of it. One idea would be going even further with this and linking into someone's weekly online shop, and then making suggestions based off what someone has in their basket, so what they could cook with that stuff, or doing it the other way around, where someone has a collection of recipes that are suggested, and then the ingredients as part of that gets added into someone's shopping basket. And giving someone just standard recipe suggestions would be likely available well before the stage of linking into shopping carts, etc. But that's an idea we would love to do. We want to get better with ways of entering in food. So having the ability to take a photo instead of typing it in, or to scan with a barcode, or even being able to just talk into the app. So like with Siri or Alexa, where you just talk it in and then just types it in for you. We'd like to have people be able to find a nutritionist through Tummy. So an individual can then use it on their own, but they can then get a nutritionist or a practitioner to then help them. And this, again, is probably going to be long term. We need to really think about this, because we would be wanting to build up a team of in-house nutritionists to be able to deliver this, because we'd want to be vetting them, and we want to know that there was quality people that we were then recommending and matching people up with. But this is something that ideally we'd like to be able to do. We would love to have it do better calorie estimations for what an individual should be having as their intake. So at the moment, we use an equation called the Mifflin-St. Jean to estimate BMI, but it's incredibly rough in its estimation. So it's something we want to improve on and say, have a calculator that asks a lot more questions about sleep time and sitting time and standing time and different levels of intensity of movement throughout the day, etc. So we could come to a better estimation. And this is always going to be an estimation. It's always going to be a little bit of a ballpark, but we'd like something was just a little better than what is currently available. We'd like to be able to handle the day-to-day business stuff that's relevant for practitioners. So taking payments or booking appointments or syncing with calendars or sending out reminders. So the businessy stuff that's mundane and menial, but it's also really time consuming to do manually. So that's some of the long-term goals and ideas, and some of it is possibly pie in the sky, or it's going to take a really long time before we get there. But we're really super excited about Tummy, and the feedback that we've been getting so far has been fantastic. And for me, it feels like the avenue that I've wanted for being able to create so many of the things that I've wanted to be offering to practitioners and to individuals. So currently, if you are a practitioner, you can sign up to use it. And the address is www.tummy, so TUMMY.io. So .io is a relatively new suffix. So instead of .com or .net, and IO stands for input-output. So it seemed appropriate for what Tummy is doing. So we went with tummy.io. But if you go there, you can then click on to see the prices. So for a practitioner account that gives you 10 client accounts, it's $25 a month. For an account that gives you 25 client accounts, it's $50 a month. And for an account that gives you 50 clients, it's $90 a month. But I'm also making an offer for a limited time, which is a chance to try out Tummy for free. So if you are a practitioner, I can then set you up with a practitioner account that you can use with up to 5 clients. And if you're an individual, I can then set you up with an individual user account. And what I would love in return for this is to get feedback on it. So what do you love about using Tummy? What do you struggle with? What could we be doing better? What has really helped you to notice patterns or to realize different things in your life? So if you are interested in trying it out, please send me an email. My email is info@7-health.com. So 7 spelled out SEVEN-health.com. And let me know, are you A, a practitioner, or are you B, an individual? And then I can get you set up with an account. I will get back to you within 48 hours or so, just depending on busyness. So yeah, please, if you're interested, get in contact. So that is it for this week's episode. I hope that you have enjoyed hearing about this project that I've been working on in the background for the last couple of years, and that I am really excited about, and hopefully you may be excited to try it out. And again, drop me an email if you are, info@7-health.com. I will be back next week with another episode, as always. It's actually the 100th episode. And so as part of that show, I'm going to be sharing lots of information about my life, about my story, stuff that I haven't talked about before. So please tune in as part of that. Look after yourself, and I will catch you again next Thursday.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7-health.com.